Hi, everyone. This is AJ Woodhams, host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war related topics. Super excited to have with me Heidi Langbein-Allen, whose new book, Save the Last Bullet Memoir of a Boy Soldier in Hitler's Army, has recently been published. Heidi was raised in Germany, France, and Spain, and lives in the USA. She wrote her father's memoirs from his taped recollections and records of the interviews. So super excited to jump right into this book. Heidi, how are you today?
I am doing fine, AJ. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks so much for joining me. Really liked this book a lot, and actually on the cover of the book, so your name is on it, but also you credit your father as the co-author. Correct?
That's right. That's right.
So I guess my first question then is, why was that important to you to credit him on this work?
Because it is his story and it is his memoir. So I guess you could say that I technically ghost wrote his memoir because I took it from 16 cassette tapes that he left for my sister and myself. And then, he put it on CDs and he sent them to us in 2007. And so I took really his story from, and stayed as as loyal to his version as possible, and then augmented it with interviews with him toward the end of his life. And
Yeah, I remember reading that in so a couple of years ago now, about a year and a half. So my father passed away, and one of the things that we have, thank you, one of the things that we have is actually a recording of him putting together like a Thanksgiving turkey recipe. And it's like 2 hours, but it's so cool to have that recording and to just, hear the voice and to have that. And when I read that these conversations were taped, and it made me think of that because of how special I think that recording of my dad is. I'm sure then those tapes are precious to you.
yeah, no, they're invaluable, and especially because I bugged him, his entire life to actually tell his story, which he really didn't want to do, as I think most soldiers don't want to really talk about what the war experience, because it's very painful, and in particular German soldiers, and of course after
Yeah.
World War II. So he was really not willing or prepared until late in life. When I finally just wore him down, and I think as he recollected, in his 70s after retirement, about his life, I think he did see the value in telling his story, at least for the family. So,
Sure.
and that was the main intent.
And
No, he
so
didn't
these
really
recordings,
expect me to write anything publishable. That
sure.
is.
So these recordings, so how did they you guys just you exchanged CDs then? Over what period of time did these recordings take place? And also what made you finally want to, I mean, I know you said that you've been wanting for a long time, but what was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back and like getting this recorded?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I sat on those tapes for a long time, so I felt like I finally had accomplished the mission of getting him to record his recollections and his experiences, and it was really fascinating to listen to it. And this was back in 2007. My father was in his 70s, and and then I put it away. I put the CDs away after listening to them a couple of times. I thought, this is wonderful. I will translate it one day for my kids to be able to understand the history. But there was no great sense of urgency, and that changed. That all changed with current events, really, with the geopolitical events unfolding in the last several years. And my father actually got very concerned about the turn of events, and in particular the rise of nationalism and of extreme movements. And he had worked his entire life to prevent that horrible war and what led up to it to reoccur. And so he had dedicated his life to do this, and he was awarded actually the Medal of European Merit for his contributions to democracy, to the furtherment of democracy in Europe. And he was very proud of that. And he got that in 1979, and he ended his career as the head of NATO Legal Germany. And he feared that the work that he had done his whole life was basically disintegrating in front of his eyes, and he was very very alarmed. And so that's when that propelled me. In fact, in 2016, it propelled me to pull out those tapes and to translate them for my family. But it was just for the family. I was gonna, because my children don't speak German, and then, long story short, a colleague at work, uh, who is a writer, got wind of it in a conversation. He says, "Oh no, no, you have to publish this." And at first I thought he was really crazy. I'd never written in my life other than for business, the, but he struck a chord. He struck a chord somewhere, and I realized, maybe he was right, and maybe the story needed to be told, just to remind people of the just devastating effects of extremism and of authoritarian rule.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that because when I was reading this book, I was like, "Holy cow!" Like, because it starts with your father, Willie. It starts, at his early childhood, and it's like a normal family. It's not it's it kind of, National Socialism was creeping up on them. I think at one point in your book, you talk about how at school one day, like one of Willie's textbooks has like this paragraph about Adolf Hitler and like how like how he was going to like save the country. And I was just imagining, I was like, what if like, I mean, it seems like it's always to me seemed, I was born in 1992. I'm 30 years old. To me, it's always seemed like so impossible that this could ever happen. But now I think it's like less impossible. And so reading your book, I thought about that a lot. Well, let's dive right in then to your father's story, and maybe first just like talk about your father as a boy, the town that this we'll talk about where this takes place. What year do we meet your father in your book, and what was his childhood like?
Yeah, my father was born in 1930 in Witten, Germany. That's in the Nordrhein-Westfalen area, the northwestern part of the country, close to the Netherlands. And he was 3 when Hitler came to power, right, in 1933. And so the book actually starts at when he was age 4, on the occasion of a golden anniversary of his grandparents. And so I started the book there because in fact, you touched on a very good point. It shows the progression of the slow manipulation efforts that started around that time to, in particular, influence also the younger population, to indoctrinate them into the Nazi regime and into the Nazi ideology. So they started very early on, and yes, they started subtly changing the textbooks in school, to change the narrative from church and parents to those themes of fatherland and blood and soil and Führer, the leader, and being sort of the only source of truth. So that just started seeping in, and children were actually encouraged to tell on their parents. Right, that's very much the informant kind of environment that you see in dictatorships, where people are encouraged to tell on each other, and slowly but surely, rule of fear and intimidation sets in.
And what was his family like? Like what were his parents like? What What was his upbringing like?
Yeah, so it's just regular folks. My grandmother was from a large family of farmers. She was one of 12, very rural. My grandfather was more of a, bourgeois, merchant class, if you will. So his father was a dry cleaners, and he actually elected to work for the government. He worked for the German railways at the time, the Reichsbahn, and he was basically, a supervisor. Um,
Yeah, and to be clear, they were not supporters of the Nazis. It was not
they
a
were
home
just,
where,
yeah,
yeah,
they were just regular folks, pretty apolitical. However, because my grandfather was a government worker, because the railways were owned by the government. He was at some point, and I can't remember the exact year. I'd have to look it up in the book. But he was forced to. Well, he wasn't even forced. He was automatically enrolled in the Nazi Party. It was
yeah,
just by default. And so that's one of the things that occurred, right? And and dissent became, of course, impossible, or even disagreement, because the first thing that would happen is folks would lose their jobs, and then they would lose their ability to get a new job, and
yeah,
therefore, their ability to feed their families. So that was typically the first thing that would happen,
sure.
and worse, of course.
Now, what was the community like itself? You write about a neighbor who was like a Nazi, and I'm sure there were many more. But like, what was the community like in terms of politics? Did people mostly support the Nazis?
That's a good question. I think there were a lot of what they call Mitläufer, which is one of those great German terms that are difficult to translate. So something like running with. So the concept of it being that they just went along and didn't question and didn't want to know. I think
Yeah,
the majority of people fit into that category. Some were ardent supporters, no question, and some didn't agree at all, but didn't dare say anything. I think that's pretty much
yeah.
where
Well,
people were.
yeah. Well, the real heart of the book is how your father, he was in the Hitler Youth. He was forced into the Hitler Youth and became a child soldier at the age of 13. But maybe let's talk a little bit about kind of leading up to that, because I learned a lot about just kind of like how that works, because you don't really hear about forced removals from families, or the build up to like getting thrown into an organization like the Hitler Youth. But maybe start like, what was like kind of the first thing with your father? What was the first event that, I think you might write at some point that children were required to join a certain political youth group, but just kind of talk about that progression.
Yeah, so the Hitler Youth was actually structured, for paramilitary training. Obviously, it was taken over actually by Hitler from other youth organizations, kind of like the Boy Scouts, that were just very popular in Germany, and so it became the Hitler Youth. Now there was a precursor to the Hitler Youth, and so boys of age 10 were enrolled into Jungvolk, which was the precursor organization, from 10 to 14. Then from 14 to 18, they were enrolled in the Hitler Youth, and from 18 on, they were passed on directly to the army during the war. This allegedly was all voluntary. However, by the time my father turned 9 years old in 1939, none of this was voluntary any longer, and the enrollment in the Jungvolk at age 10 was mandatory.
And so I think you're right too that, much like, a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old in an organization like the Boy Scouts, your father, he thought it was fun. It was not. Talk a little bit about, I guess, his attitudes and his feelings about being a 10-year-old in this organization.
Oh, yeah, no, he thought it was great fun because that's what it was structured to be. It was supposed to have a bunch of fun activities where, of course, in reality, what they were getting was paramilitary training, target practice, but it was made to be fun. And,
Yeah.
of course, with, BB guns, I'm assuming, not real ammunition, things like that, throwing grenades, but it was a field game, and it was a tag game, and but in reality they were just, teaching him all these things, marches, military songs, yeah, but it was all made to be very, fun,
Yeah.
and outdoor activities, sports. And so the insidious thing behind that, of course, was, first of all, they were being indoctrinated without knowing it into a certain, way of thinking, but also they were being separated from a church and parents more and more because these activities used to take place right after school in the afternoons, and frequently so, like 3 times a week, and then on weekends when they were supposed to be in church.
Yeah.
And I think you actually asked me one question I didn't answer, which was, did it maybe become apparent to him that something wasn't quite 100% right? And I think one of the earliest points was when his father was taking him to school, and he was just dragging him along, and my father heard strange noises and saw a red glow in the background. He figured out much later, by the way, that actually what he saw was the after effects of Kristallnacht, of the Night of Broken Glass, where thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed, and hundreds of synagogues were burnt. And in fact, the synagogue of the city of Witten was burned to the ground, and he saw it on his way to school. And he was very shocked. So he realized at a level, I guess, an 8-year-old can, that something just wasn't right, but he didn't know what.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to try, and we're obviously so much later, hindsight is 2020, but it's so interesting to try and, put myself in the place of an 8-year-old or, a 9-year-old, because, to him, the indoctrination, this is normal. This is all he's ever, I mean, not all he's ever known, but this has been a large part of his life. I mean, 1930, that's very close to Hitler coming to power anyway.
Yeah.
And so, thinking back, it probably is a challenge to know, like, when things, how did you know that, like, something wasn't right here? But then, obviously too, that as you just said, that very famous event, Kristallnacht, even that, for a child, it's like, oh, that this can't be right. And I think too, like, you write a little bit about how Willie's parents, like, they know that things are wrong, but as you mentioned, it could be very easy for Willie to say the wrong thing at school, and they go to jail or something like that. Talk a little bit about how your grandparents, how Willie's parents, how did they approach the topic with Willie? How did they navigate?
They basically didn't. So that's I think very it was very common because of that, because of the fear, and because of seeing what happened to people and neighbors who actually happened to talk about things. And there was a couple of examples. There was a gentleman who was a lawyer whom they knew, and that's not in the book actually, but he was asked to join the party, and I guess he didn't realize that wasn't just an invitation, that was optional. And so he apparently even didn't even decline, said he would think about it. The next day, he was dismissed, and he was
Yeah.
never able to find a job again. And then another neighbor, just gentleman that had a business, I guess, made some comment, and he was actually never seen again. He lost his business. People were strongly encouraged not to pursue business with him, and then he disappeared. So they didn't talk about it at all. In fact, when my father started asking more questions, because they actually were acquainted with a Jewish family, and he used to go there to get, my grandmother and the lady were friends, and my grandmother used to take my father there for the lady to babysit him. And the lady had a young child who was younger than my father, and they played, and then suddenly he just realized he didn't, he wasn't seeing them, he wasn't going there anymore. And he was asking questions, and they simply shut him down. It's like, yeah, don't ask stupid questions. Well, what about the star? Yeah, well, that's to know they're Jews. And he asked, well, why? And he's like, yeah, just shut up and just don't ask questions, right? So it's
Yeah.
very, very sad. Now, in the end, that family actually, that's, reappears in the book, of course. Actually, my grandmother ended up helping the family and actually hid the lady and her son at the very end of the war, because they took the gentleman to Theresienstadt, to the concentration camp in Theresienstadt, and he survived, though, luckily, and came back, which was extraordinary. But they had lost all means of survival, and then at the end, so in 45, it became so that she would have been deported as well, with the child, even though she was German. So the reason she hadn't actually been taken to the concentration camp was because she was German, and the child was considered this is a terrible word, but a bastard. It was horrible, and so she had no way of surviving. But she wasn't taken because she was German. She had refused to divorce her Jewish husband, which was then basically you were forced to do that. She refused, and then she became an outcast. And in 45, though, they would have taken her because the war had become desperate,
Yeah.
and it was victory or death, and there was the final solution, and so there was no more tolerance for anything,
Yeah.
and it became just savage. And so my grandmother hid her in the coal cellar
Oh,
for some time.
yeah. And, I really, you get through your book, desperation is at the beginning, the chapters leading up to when your father is forced into the Hitler Youth. It's a slow buildup, and you feel the desperation. And especially, he's a child soldier. What kind of country sends their children, to war? A very desperate regime. Talk a little bit about. So the war has started, and this is something that I learned, that children, when the Allies started bombing German cities, the children were at first encouraged to leave, or families were encouraged to send their children off into the countryside, and I think later forced. Talk about that. What? uh, How
Yeah,
did how did that happen?
yeah, that is one of the most, sort of twisted, parts of how the regime managed to manipulate, the population. In 1943, and this program caught up with my father. So the program was called Kinderlandverschickung, KLV, and it stands for Children's Relocation Program. And it was touted as almost like a vacation, and as protection against Allied bombing for the children. So the Nazi regime was encouraging parents to do this. This was a voluntary program, allegedly, where parents would surely want their children to be safe from Allied bombing. So these are mostly city children, right? And this program was was for city children, and they would take the children away from the influence of the parents and the church, of course, because that was the ultimate design for this program, not a vacation. And the boys in particular were to receive actual military training to then be put into action as if and as necessary, and they deemed it to be necessary in 1945 to send my father, who then was just 14, in March 1945, at the very end of the war, to the Eastern Front, which was actually in Austria at the time.
Yeah, and your grandparents resist this a little bit in the beginning because, they don't want it. It's their only son, if I remember correctly. They don't want to send their child off, but the pressure from the community is so intense that I think that eventually they more or less have no choice. If I'm remembering that right.
That's exactly right. So the program was voluntary. However, it was mandatory to by law to enroll children in school. Right? Children had to receive schooling. So in North Rhine-Westphalia, they closed the schools, whereby parents would be in violation of the law for not sending their children to school. Well, they couldn't. The only way they could send their children to school was to enroll them in the program and have them removed from their homes. And
Yeah.
that's how the voluntary program actually worked, right? So yes, I mean, they had nothing back then was a choice. It was basically, as we saw, the obliteration of free will, right?
So
And applied in slow doses and then accelerating, in the war.
how did your father so he's 13 at this point when he gets sent to this, I think at 13 at this point where he's
13.
sent off near Austria. How did he feel about
So he got sent
being sent off?
to the program in at age 13 and got sent to the border with Switzerland. Again, that's 43. So allegedly, again, to be protected from bombing and to receive better schooling, which of course didn't happen. But that was I guess, the excuse. And so he was with the host family, who, of course, that was mandatory for host families to host these children. That was also not a choice. They were just placed. This family that he was with was actually very kind, but they had 9 children, I think altogether. I recollect, yeah, 9. And so, and they were very hungry. So there was actually a, by 1943, the war had really, damaged, the infrastructure of Germany severely, and there was no food, and so they was starting to experience pretty severe issues.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, in 44, he was then sent to a remote village in the mountains because there started to be a mass exodus from the east to the west of civilians, mostly actually fleeing the Russians and coming into droves into that region. So they were removed in 44. In 44, then, oh, I forgot to mention. So they were removed in sort of in groups, right? These children were taken as a whole, like, class. So with all school classmates and teachers. So the whole class was taken, and there was a Nazi handler. So the Nazi handler was there to do surveillance on the teachers and the children at all times, right? And so they then all get shipped off to this remote village, and then the SS showed up
Yeah,
to
and you
pick out the good candidates for being thrown to into war. And so they picked the taller, larger kids that my father unfortunately was part of. So there were 3 in his class, actually only 3 that were picked, and he was one of them because he was, considered to be strong enough.
and you write too a little bit about how he couldn't return home. There were, I guess, Hitler Youth, older watchers maybe who would make sure. So, for example, you write about a scene in your book where your grandparents, they send a train ticket, I believe, for Willie to come home for Christmas, and Willie has to sneak home. Talk a little bit about that scene and why that was happening.
Yeah, so once removed, the children were actually not allowed to return home. The parents could visit, but that became very difficult, of course, because actually the entire rail system was getting pretty deteriorated, and so the whole thing was was really meant to permanently separate the kids from their parents. And this train ticket shows up because my grandfather worked for the German railways. But it was very naive, I think, on their part. I believe that my grandfather thought, and that's what my father's belief was, thinking back on it later, that my grandfather thought that my father could do this, that he could get on a train and come home for Christmas, which of course was not allowed. And so he basically, yeah, he had to sneak into the train. He was desperately homesick, so and he was 13 and a half, and he actually, with the help of the host family, took a huge risk, by the way, because the host family could have been punished for this, and got on a train and actually did make it home for Christmas. And then upon his return was of course punished by the Nazi regime, by the Hitler Youth, who picked him right out of the train as he returned home, because by then they'd figured out that he was missing, and they were checking every train that was returning from that region.
Well, what was it? What were the conditions like? So 1945 is when your father is forced into the war. In that time where leading right up to 1945, what were the conditions like for him in this Hitler Youth kind of, I'm not sure what you want to call it, but maybe compound that he's
Yeah.
been forced to live on.
Yeah, it was, yeah, basically compound would be a good word for it. At this point, they're completely isolated. There's no connection to the outside world. There's communications are, basically destroyed. There is no food, so they were literally starving. I mean, they were resorting to eating, I think, beets is all they had left, and so the children were very very scared, very hungry. The SS showed up. I remember my father just at the time sort of describing them as incredibly creepy. And the kids were at the time they were stealing food wherever they could, because it was survival. And also I think as kids, they thought it was kind of maybe a fun prank to go and steal some food from the butcher. I guess the local butcher had some food in the cellar, whatever provisions they had left, and they would regularly sneak in and steal some food because they were so hungry. And unfortunately, when the SS showed up, and they had a depot with food, one kid snuck in to the SS depot and stole food there, and unfortunately, he was caught by the SS. And stealing from the SS was punishable by death, and it didn't matter how old you were. And so this 14-year-old was executed by the SS to make an example out of him, and the children, including my father, were made to watch the execution.
I remember reading that, and
And that was
I
something that,
was,
yeah, that woke him up
yeah,
at night for many
I'm sure.
years. With nightmares.
Yeah, and I remember reading about how even like there were people who were not in the SS who were pleading like, don't do this. You have to be out of your mind or whatever. But this is almost the end of the war at this point. We're almost in 1945, and the SS is like, no, like stealing food is like stealing from Hitler himself or something like that, and show no mercy
No
and just
mercy.
have parade everyone out. Actually, I don't think it was everyone. I think it was the older children were paraded out. I could be wrong.
Yeah,
And they're like, you've got to watch. And this kid is just lined up and shot in front of them all.
yeah,
And I thought, oh gosh, that was one of the scenes that really stuck out to me in the book.
yeah, yeah. The ruthlessness, right, of the regime became apparent at this point.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about then your father becoming a soldier. How did that happen, and what activities was he expected to perform?
So three of the kids in the class got picked out, including my father. The SS gave them
And
a
how old is he at
choice.
this time?
He's 14. He's
Okay.
he's he's turned 14. And so they're given a choice of no, at first they're given training. So they're just sent to training. They're sent to training. It's a 2 month training camp that they're going to, and that is military training. So that's outright, they are being taught to use the weapons that they will be using. That includes the Panzerfaust, which is like a bazooka. It can only be for that. Well, that Panzerfaust could only be fired once. It was a one-time, weapon, and it would penetrate the hull of a tank and explode inside. And they were also taught how to use the machine gun, which was allegedly one of the first machine guns that was, they would shoot true at like 1,000 meters. So it was very revolutionary at the time, and the handgun. So they were taught to use these weapons for 2 months, and then they were sent back to this school camp, just basically waiting to be engaged in the war. And of course that happened, right? So in March of, 45, the SS then came knocking and said, "All right, it's time." And they gave him a choice. They said, "You can come with us with the SS," and they promised him, warm food and warm beds, and or they could choose to go to the regular army. So all three of them immediately chose the army because they were very apprehensive of the SS, and obviously knowing how they acted. So they wanted to get away from the SS and joined the army, and they were immediately shipped out that day. I think, and I believe, it was the 18th of March, or the 18th or the 19th. And I remember that because my father's village got razed to the ground on that day, and he didn't know it until much later, until he finally made it home
Yeah,
after the
he
war.
hadn't been able to communicate with his family for a long time, so he had no idea, right?
Right. No, he had no clue what had happened to his parents, and so then he got shipped off to the front.
And so, what was when he was on the front? What was what was that like for him? I know you mentioned that he's basically got a bazooka that he's firing at tanks. What is he treated as a normal soldier? What are the types of things that are expected from him?
Yep, they had these 3 14-year-olds. He might have been truly the youngest generation to be in that war, because allegedly they would take only the 16-year-olds, and of course it was the Volkssturm. That was another, is it was a movement, right? That the Volkssturm would engage the younger kids and the old men, 60 and up, into this war effort. My father was an exception, not because he was the youngest, my father and his two classmates, but also because he was engaged in the regular army. So he wasn't a paramilitary unit, he was in an actual army unit. And so it made it, I guess, more dramatic and much more dangerous, because he was actually shipped to the front. They were treated like any other soldier. There's no difference. They were in his first battle. He was outfitted with four of these bazookas, and of course, if you ran out of those four, good luck, because they could only be fired once, and each of them could take out one tank. And then they had the machine gun and the handgun. And so in his first battle was, we don't know the exact date, but it was either March 31st or April 1st. So really toward the end of the war. And the battle he was actually in was incredibly important, but he had no idea, of course, until he pieced it all together much later, because it was the last battle before the Battle of Vienna. So it was the last sort of bastion of, defense of the Germans in the city of Wiener Neustadt, which is just south of Vienna, trying to stave off the advance of the Ukrainian second and third armies, I think. And they were defeated in that battle. My father almost died, and then they went into retreat.
Yeah, if I remember right, he was actually bayoneted, right? He was in his leg.
Yes.
and lived the rest of his life. You write it towards the end with like those wounds, and I think even later after the war, he had some wounds. How did your father feel at the time? You know, he's 14. He's to be a soldier. Is something that it's a proud thing. You're fighting for your country, and of course, at the time, he didn't realize that Germany, one, was losing, but also two, that nobody knew the extent of the atrocities. But how did he feel about being a soldier?
He was, well, it was no doubt absolutely terrifying. But at the same time, yes. So his belief, because that's what he'd been told his whole life, was that he was defending his home country, right? He was defending his his homeland against invasion by the Russians. That was what he knew, right? That's what he was being told. And they were also being told, of course, that they were winning the war and that they were superior and that they would, prevail. And that was the narrative. And so he was there to proudly defend his fatherland and sacrifice his life for the Führer because that's what he was being told to do, and that's what he believed he was doing. He was thinking that he was defending, his country.
So, at what point did it become apparent that Germany was not winning the war?
Well, I did. So I think pretty quickly, right? So at the time that this battle unfolded, and they were pushed into desperate retreat. It dawned on them that they'd lost most of their unit. They were just they engaged in a few more battles. They actually got awarded. My father got awarded the Iron Cross with the rest of what was left of his unit. I think in an attempt to, boost morale, etc. Even though clearly, this was, I mean, we're talking April now, uh, and they continued to retreat. In what they found out it was this was not being spoken about, but what they found out they were doing is they were trying to get to the demarcation line that the leaders of the unit had somehow intercepted in some radio, I guess, communication, I'm assuming, that yes, they were losing the war and that there was going to be obviously a takeover, and the country was going to be divided into the Russian side and an American side, and if they had any hopes of survival, they needed to make it to the American side as quickly as possible. And so the rumors were that the demarcation line between what was going to be the Russian controlled area and the American controlled area was known to be in the city of Lietzen in Austria, separated by a river. And north of the river was going to be the American side, and south was going to be the Russian side. So that's what they were desperately trying to get to.
And on the way, something that I was struck by was the SS trying, like they were going around, and well, I keep I'm like trying to say what's in your book, but why don't you say what was the
Yeah.
SS doing with these fleeing soldiers?
So as part of this final, solution and Volkssturm, etc., again there was no such thing as surrendering to the enemy. So Hitler had made it clear that it was victory or death. So nobody was basically going to survive this if he had a hand in it. And so the SS was doing, they were collecting any soldiers, any German soldiers who might be lost or maybe just simply separated from the units, and they would immediately label them deserters and kill them. And so as the rest of the unit of my father with their, who was left in charge was a lieutenant, were making it back, they got through this village where they saw a German soldier hanging from a tree. and they realized what was going on. And they actually almost like basically ran into the SS, two SS men who had just gotten hold of a young soldier who obviously must have been lost. And it was, pretty obvious that they were going to kill him. They were going to hang him as well. And so the lieutenant and and the five, six, seven soldiers that were there, including my father, ambushed the SS and killed them, and so saved the soldier's life.
Yeah, I remember reading that and thinking that was pretty incredible. So your father eventually does, he makes it. He surrenders with his unit to the Allies, and then he's put in captivity. Talk about his time in captivity.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting situation because they do make it to the American side of the demarcation line. Unbeknownst to them, they actually cross that river to the American side on the day that Germany surrenders. They did not know this, of course. They had no communication, or at least not well, and no, they didn't know it at that point. So my father then, actually the next day they're doing military drills. So again, they don't know the war is over, and my father accidentally runs into Americans who have in fact made it there, and they're in a jeep, and he's in full gear, and they are too, and they just basically just look at each other. My father was kind of frozen. They were frozen for a minute, and the American jeep just turned around and left. And my father was flabbergasted. It went back running to his lieutenant because at this point he knew we were looking for the Americans. He goes, "Well, the Americans are here. The Americans are here," and that's when the lieutenant tells him, "Langbein, we've just heard the war's over." And so then it made sense. Of course, that's why the Americans left and didn't engage because it was the permanently ceasefire was permanent because the war was over. And then they were taken. Yes, they basically agreed to be taken prisoner, and they weren't prisoners of war because the war was over. They were interned persons, and so they were in this weird situation um, that was sort of undetermined, an undetermined status, and so they didn't quite know what to do with them, and so they eventually triaged them. But I mean, they were clearly treated like prisoners. So they were in this open camp, and they weren't even. I mean, it was an open field. They weren't even any barracks per se, and they were held there for some time until they figured out what to do with them, and which was basically triage them. The vast majority of them to be sent to actually to France to sweep minefields and to work in mines. And those soldiers didn't come back until like 47 or 48.
When did your father eventually return to Germany?
So he actually, when the triage was happening, I think that was really a stroke of genius on his side. He was really smart to figure that out. He saw that there were basically being separated when they were being triaged out into two lines, and one line was longer than the other. And the shorter line, he overheard that they were asking the soldiers what their peacetime occupation was, and he noticed that the ones that said farmer were getting sent to the shorter line, and he accurately suspected that those folks probably were going to get sent home because they needed to till the land, and food was needed, and the rest probably wasn't going to be sent home. And he played his cards right. He took a huge gamble, and when they asked him what his peacetime occupation was, he said he was a student and a farmer. And indeed, that did work out for him because he was sent home after that.
Well, Heidi, this has been a really been an incredible interview. Your book, like I said, I enjoyed it so much. My kind of last question here: what do you hope people take away from this story?
I hope they take away from this story again a reminder of the just destruction that is wrought by authoritarian regimes, where people no longer have free will, and it destroys. Authoritarian regimes destroy their own country, not just others, right? And also the legacy of my father, who, when he figured out finally and pieced it all together and got out of his depression, he decided he was going to do something about it, and he did. Right? He dedicated the rest of his life, his career, to furthering democracy in the world.
Yeah. Well, that's really incredible, and I'm so glad that you shared his story, and I'm so glad that his story was recorded, and I hope lots of people read it, because I really I thought it was I mean it was a good book, but it was a very timely book to read as maybe a reminder of how wrong it can go.
Yeah, sadly, very
Yeah,
timely, as we see with the Ukraine and Russia, unfortunately,
yeah,
right now, where children are being indoctrinated to
right,
this very moment. It's happening again. So yeah, sadly.
yeah. Well, Heidi, where can folks find you if they want to find you? Are you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on social media. I have a website, HeidiLangbein-Author.com. My book, Save the Last Bullet, is available at bookstores. I'm Barnes and Noble, Warwick's here locally in San Diego, nationwide, actually worldwide, also through Amazon. So you
Great,
can find the book wherever books are sold. Really, it can be ordered.
wonderful, perfect. Well, Heidi Langbein-Allen, Allen, Heidi Langbein-Allen, Save the Last Bullet, Memoir of a Boy Soldier in Hitler's Army. Go pick up a copy. Go check it out from your library. Give it a read. And Heidi, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.